So last time we spent some time talking about the politics of personality and how we've seen this shift from politicians wanting to talk about the Constitution and the principles and the ideas of America to just trying to be the most well-liked, right? We compared it to a high school prom court, so to speak, which is kind of fitting as the government becomes more and more like a king. But
I was never one of those guys.
I wasn't either. But there's a deeper conversation there, right? And this isn't new. This isn't something that just started. It's really rooted in identity politics. And I think we need to spend a good amount of time over either the rest of today or maybe even the next 2 weeks talking about identity politics and talking about the roots of how we got to this point and how tribalism has played into this and everything else. And
it's sort of fitting, right? Because in a certain way, this notion of identity politics or cults of personality, I mean, that when you really get down to it, that's what our politics has become, a cult of personality, stands in direct opposition to a politics of principles, right? Where what's most important are the ideas, the principles, rather than who do we like cheerleading for or cheerleading against.
And you say that, and I find that in the media too, right? We've not only started cheerleading for or against politicians, we're cheerleading for the cheerleaders.
Yes.
Right? We're seeing who are the people out there who are cheerleading for Donald Trump, who are the people cheerleading for Joe Biden.
Right.
And then we're cheerleading for them. It's this domino effect that
and demonizing the opposite guys, right? If someone's cheerleading for the guy I don't like, then I demonize those cheerleaders.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the important conversation that we have to start with, right, before we can talk about identity politics in terms of a modern political regime, we probably should do a deep exploration of what is the roots of identity politics? What's the philosophical and theoretical roots of where it came from so that everybody can really understand better how we got here.
Yeah, we need to do a kind of brief but deep dive into the world of ideas so that members of the Vino and Vertitas Society have a deeper, principled, philosophic understanding of where we are. And then what we can do a little later is come back and tie this into more contemporary policy questions, recent Supreme Court cases that have played right into this whole notion. We'll get into that stuff. I would sort of frame the subject this way. I'm gonna talk here about tribalism, looking out at the human population and dividing human beings into groups and saying this is part of my group, and I'm going to take care of them and give them advantages, very often by somehow ripping off or doing something bad to anyone who's not in my group, who's in these other groups. Now, that way of looking at the world in a tribalistic way, that's ancient. That's been going on as long as there have been human beings. There's written history. Academics like to divide the world into the historical world and the prehistorical world because there's archaeological evidence that there were human beings before there was even written historical records. That's prehistory or prehistorical. But certainly throughout the roughly 6,000 years of history that we have written evidence of, this has been the way most human beings have lived. This has been the way they thought. This has been the way their governments have operated in a tribal way. And so that phenomenon of tribalism isn't anything new. Here's what is new. In 1776, this small group of people on the eastern shore of what used to be British North America, they launch a revolution and they say, how about if we try to build a regime that is a model of a government that's not tribal? We're going to base this government on ideas that are universal, that apply to all human beings. We're standing on this idea that every human being has an equal natural right to his own person, to his own freedom, regardless of his culture, regardless of whether he agrees or not. Even if he rejects that idea, we're saying he still has a natural right to his own freedom, right? Which is the beauty of it. Regardless of what anyone looks like or what their preferences in music or food or sex or anything else, it doesn't matter. Everyone has a natural right to their own person. And so it's a rare moment in history. And what we're seeing today is a resurgence in tribalism. It's the foundation of what we're calling politics of identity or personality. The difference is this new kind of tribalism, it's fueled by the authority of modern philosophy, modern science. And so it's much more sophisticated. It's much less instinctual than ancient forms of tribalism. And it goes back to some key thinkers. I've got a few of their books here. The first and most important is, here, I'll show this for our audience here. This is some of the important essays by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau is a key, pivotal figure in the history of philosophy, and especially for modern philosophy. Rousseau really launches what becomes postmodern philosophy. Thinkers as various from Hegel to Kant to Karl Marx to Friedrich Nietzsche are all in a way disciples of Rousseau. They study Rousseau and they're building upon and expanding the kernels of ideas in Rousseau. And here's the connection between Rousseau and this notion of tribalism and identity politics. The thing that Rousseau argued that was so groundbreaking, earth-shattering, transformational, he's the first thinker to come along and say, reason is unnatural. Reason is not part of nature. Now, I mean, going back to everyone, Machiavelli assumed that reason is natural, that when human beings use their reason, it's connecting them to the natural world around them. Cicero thought this. Aristotle thought this. Aristotle made the argument that reason, remember the Greek word for reason was logos, and logos means reason, it means logic, it also means speech, because these things are all connected, right? When we reason through speech, through language. We assemble sentences or equations right in our mind, and we think about these things. And Aristotle said reason is the distinguishing feature of human beings. There are other animals that have skin, that have hair, that have eyes. We have lots in common with many other animals, but no other animal has reason by nature.
For the audience, if they go back and they watch episodes of our American Idea Toolbox, and they go back to some of our previous podcasts, we've talked about that, right? It's the difference between beast and God, and humans being somewhere in the middle, and it's what separates us from the animals, right?
That's right.
It's what allows us to understand that things like slavery are wrong.
Yep.
So I think if anybody wants to dig into that more, we should at least remind them that we've done a lot of other content that's throughout the website, especially in those toolbox episodes.
Agreed.
About that difference between what separates humans and what makes us unique.
And here's the great challenge posed by Mr. Rousseau. Mr. Rousseau, if he was here today and could watch our toolbox videos, he would vehemently reject them. Right. He would say they're fundamentally flawed. And the reasons he would reject them are so illuminating for our world today. You're right. We talk in those toolbox videos about the difference between beasts and human beings, that the animals have appetites and instincts, things like that. And so do we. We have instincts, we have appetites, but we also have reason by nature. That's the ancient classical view. That's the view of the American founders. And so we're this combination or compound being, right? We feel the pull on our soul of our instincts and our appetites, but we also have this reason. We can think and make choices. Should I give in to my appetite or should I not? Anyone who's tried to go on a diet has experienced that pull between your appetites, for the extra piece of cake, and your reason that says, no, chubby, you don't need that extra piece of cake.
Well, and if you look at the difference between that and, the number of people who have dogs that they train, right? We all have dogs. We train them to not go to the bathroom in the house. You just got a brand new puppy.
I got a new puppy.
You're dealing with this every day.
Yep.
You're training them to do different things, not necessarily to do tricks, and not necessarily it's things for their own good.
Mm-hmm.
But they lack the capability of figuring that out on their own.
That's right.
If a dog eats too fast and gets sick, it's not going to not eat too fast the next time.
Our puppy has discovered electrical cords. It's scary, right? I mean,
Right.
so we now have to watch this puppy all the time to make sure he doesn't go electrocute himself by chewing on an electrical cord.
And he would probably do it a second time. Even if he got electrocuted the first time and got that shock, he would go back and be curious enough to go do it again.
I don't know.
Whereas
Our puppy's really smart, so maybe
well.
not our puppy.
But on the other hand, we talk about as children, if I touch a hot stove, I'm going to learn, don't touch a hot stove. It burns and it hurts. And that's sort of the difference between this basic idea of just doing what your instincts tell you. The dog's instinct is to chew on electrical cords, whereas as human beings, even as children, can learn things and adapt and start to make better decisions.
And what's really important there is we can learn things, we can contemplate things, understand things that are abstract, that are not right in front of us physically. Think, well, I've got Mr. Nietzsche on the table here. Nietzsche pointed this out. Human beings are the only ones who can understand and appreciate history. We can look at what human beings were doing and saying, and we can judge arguments they were making from 2,000 years ago and decide, do we think it's right or wrong or right? But the point is, we can have some appreciation and understanding. There's no other animal who thinks, what were my ancestors doing 2,000 years ago?
But the only difference there is time, right? It's still the last time I touched a stove, it was hot and it burned me.
Right.
Or 500 years ago, my ancestors did this, and look at the result. I better not do that again.
Right. Although we human beings do have a bad way of repeating history, right? We have this capacity to learn, and so often we fail to listen to what our reason tells us. Well, to bring this back to Mr. Rousseau,
Sure.
Mr. Rousseau says when we're talking about the difference between human beings and beasts, he says, I'm not so sure there's a difference. One of the things that made Rousseau incredibly controversial, including when his second discourse was published, it was banned. Governments, churches were burning his materials because he made this what was a very unorthodox, highly controversial, highly charged proposal. He said, maybe there's no difference between the beasts and human beings. This is a century before Darwin. He proposed an experiment. He said, if you had some gorillas or monkeys or orangutans or something, right, procreating with human beings, then we would know whether they're actually distinct species or whether biologically they're all connected. Now, he doesn't do those experiments. He proposes that other people go and do this. So you can start to see these ideas, these evolutionary ideas, right, that human beings really emerged from and are connected to in a fundamental biologic, genetic way to other orders of animals long before Darwin comes along. He goes a step further. And when he says that reason is unnatural, it is part of a critique. He says that language is unnatural. Now, we all know there are different languages, right? The German language is different from the English language and the Spanish language and the Chinese language, right? And there's all kinds of variants. But his critique was of language, period, the phenomenon of language. Language, the basic, and here's where we're going to dive into some kind of deep, heady philosophic waters. The foundation of every language is the common noun. So think in English we have, cup, book, dog, tree, mountain. These are all common nouns, right? They're categories. And within any category, the word cup, the common noun cup, is a category. And there can be an infinite number of cups of infinite sizes, right? You could look, someone could have my daughter used to have a little, what do they call a doll, like a Victorian style dollhouse. Sure. And there were little, right, she had little tea sets and things. So the point is, there were tiny little cups. You could imagine a sculpture of a great big cup, all different sizes, but they're all equally cups. They all fit into this category of cups. Here's what Rousseau says. That category is an invention of the human will it's not rooted in nature. So what we call trees or bushes or mountains, this is human willfulness imposing an order on the world that doesn't actually exist by nature. The world's not divided into these categories. His argument is there's just an infinite number of particulars. In fact, he says the common noun has no basis in nature. Proper nouns do. Proper names. Every grain of sand should have an individual name. Every tree, right, should have an individual name because it's an individual being. Rousseau makes the argument the difference between two grains of sand, the differences are more important than what they have in common. Therefore, they're two totally different beings. Now, this is all kind of fun and games when you're thinking about cups and trees and grains of sand and dogs and cats. How about the common noun man or the common noun human? All moral teaching, whether it is derived from a divine source, whether it's religious in nature, whether it's philosophic, whether you pick up Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, every moral code, the very premise is that human being is a category, right? And all human beings are in this category, and we exclude non-human beings. We don't hold horses and dogs and cats to the same moral standard as we do human beings, because human beings have this reason. Rousseau said that's a mistake. There is no general category of man or human being. Whether you spell human with M-A-N or M-Y-N at the beginning, for him it doesn't matter.
Right.
And so he blows up this notion of any moral truth that applies to all human beings, because all human beings don't really have anything important in common. He blows up the idea that reason can know anything about human nature, because his argument is there is no common universal human nature. They're just particular beings. And if we can't reason our way to the truth, what we're left with then is everything in our lives that make an impression on us, the culture surrounding us, the customs, the habits, the laws, the traditions, the pressures, the physical geography of wherever we grow up. So the conclusion is there's just different cultural perspectives. There is no one reason. There's no one objective truth. There's just cultural perspectives. And if you grow up in a different culture than I grow up, you're going to look at the world one way. I'm going to look at the world in a way that my culture has shaped me to look in. And neither of us is right. Neither of us is correct, because there is no objective truth that can be discerned by natural reason, because there's no natural reason.
And if we break that down, I mean, if you break that down to its most simple form, that means that we're not all entitled to our own life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Until you said that, and we've had this conversation so many times before, but until you just said that, it just struck me the root of the conversation that starts in 4th, 5th, 6th grade for anybody born in the 70s or later, which is you're all individual snowflakes, right? And you're all unique, and no one can understand and I never really made that connection all the way back to tribalism, right? I get the you're special, and I get the threats that causes in terms of expectations in life and everything else, but that's actually breeding this sense of, because we're all different, do we not all have the same right?
Let's be real clear here. The truth is, right, that every human being is unique in certain ways, and every human being has much in common with every other human being, right? So you and I are different in all kinds of ways, but we're equal in this way. You and I both have the same equal natural right to our own person, our own freedom. But what modern philosophy, what's being taught to children today, is that we're individual and we're different, period. Right. They leave off the important moral, political precepts that are inherent in human nature, because thinkers like Rousseau and his disciples have really been victorious in the realm of ideas. Their ideas have triumphed. So what we're left with is this view that our cultural background, the perspective that emerges through cultural forces, That's all that we have. And there's no way to say that anyone is right or anyone is better or more true. To make that judgment requires some objective standard of truth or goodness, right, for all human beings in order to rank cultures and say, well, this culture is more civilized or more just, right, than some. It would require some standard by which you judge cultures. And modern political philosophy, modern tribalism, our politics of identity say there is no objective standard. Just take that away, and what you're left with is a bunch of different cultural points of view, to the point now where, I mean, if you're really a cutting edge intellectual in the world of higher learning, higher education, I mean on the razor's edge of the forefront, then you're making arguments that things like math are just subjective. That's just a prejudice. That's just a perspective, right? Because there's this refusal to acknowledge any kind of objective truth, even in the realm of math or science or anything else. It's a kind of philosophic nihilism. And this has led then to, when you start to politicize this, to thinkers saying, okay, let's look at all the different groups, all the different cultures. There are black people, that's a group, that's a culture. There's women, that's a culture, that's a group. There's LGBTQ, that's a group. Poor people, they're a group. Let's see what we think they need or what we think they want, and then we'll provide special perks, special favors, special subsidies, and maybe some affirmative action to whatever different tribes, different groups need. It's incompatible. This view of moral relativism, of cultural relativism, is incompatible with the idea of equal protection of the laws for the equal individual natural rights of all citizens.
Then you start thinking about the subcategories. I mean, that's where this all gets out of control, right? When you think of women are a group, and black people are a group, and LGBTQ people are a group, and trans people are a group within the LGBTQ community. So what if you're a black woman who's trans and LGBTQ?
Right.
So now you have to look at that very specific group and say, what does that group need? What is their subjective truth?
Right.
Right. What is the truth for them versus the truth for a black gay woman?
Yep.
Right. And we're talking about minuscule differences.
Right.
In the end, there is the truth that they are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But politically, we've had to get to a point of how do I make that group feel like they're getting their truth? Well,
and here's where it gets really complicated. So from this general view of cultural relativism, that there is no right and wrong, there's no truth about human nature. The Greeks, for example, they were just wrong when they said there are certain virtues that are good for all human beings. No, that was just a cultural prejudice. This leads thinkers and activists, advocates, to then demand, they say, well, all cultures are equal, therefore all cultures should be equally represented. So if blacks make up 10%, 20%, 30% of a city's population or a state population, whatever it is, then they should represent that same percentage in any industry, in any business. Same thing with women. Same thing with LGBTQ and trans people within that category. And it leads to this kind of affirmative action network. And yet there's a contradiction there. And the contradiction is in the very premise that all cultures are equal. They're not equal. They're certainly not equal when it comes to attaining certain goals. So if you have a culture of people, if you buy into the multiculturalism and you start dividing people into groups and you'll actually look at the groups and you study them and survey them, what you find is not all groups, for example, are equal in preparing their children for learning. If you have one group where 90% of families do not encourage reading and study and homework, And then you have another group where 90% of families do encourage their children to read and study and do their homework. Well, in the academic world, for example, you're going to get very different results. And this leads to really ugly conversations. They're almost always behind closed doors. These conversations, you can just imagine the conversations of affirmative action. I like to talk about it, identity politics as the politics of the boxes, right? Because, on those forums, whether it's a college application form or a job application or so, there's always those little boxes. Are you African American? Are you Hispanic? And the thing about those boxes, there's never just one or two. There's never 50. There's always 5, 6, 7 of those boxes. How do those boxes get to be there? Well, there's some committee somewhere sitting around a conference table actually having serious discussions about who gets a box, which group, which culture gets a box. And very often they get lobbied representatives of those different groups. So someone from the LGBTQ community comes in and says, here's why we deserve a box. We deserve extra points. We deserve extra subsidies, something, because here's how we've been victimized. Here's our suffering as a group. And you think about how those conversations must go. I often imagine myself being in one of those. I'd love to be in one of those discussions. I'd say, how about the Jews? Man, historically, Jews have faced some persecution and some tough time around the world, even here in the United States. But then they look and they see, man, those Jews do pretty well in school. They tend to get good grades and do well in the tests. And so, screw the Jews. They don't get a box, right? How about Asians? There's an ethnic minority in the United States, small little percentage. Should they get a box? Should they get special? Well, no, they're kicking everyone's rear end. Academically, they earn lots of money. And so that's where you end up with in this kind of identity politics, this effort to equalize things that are not equal. And this kind of brings me to the next stage in this whole notion of identity politics. I think it was predicted most accurately by Tocqueville in his book Democracy in America. What Tocqueville argued, he said, in the modern world, this notion of equality, whether rightly understood or wrongly understood, doesn't matter. The abstract concept of equality has become the moral high ground, that anything that is said to promote equality or wrapped up in equality is very likely to succeed, and anything that is presented as inequality on its face, it's almost certain to be doomed. It will not fail. And so this is another one of the contradictions, right, of our identity politics. We are engaged in public policies, regulations, where we say, let's divide everyone into groups. They're all different. We're going to try to give some special perks and favors in the name of equality. And then they go out and they say, there's really two words, diversity and equality, right? We're doing these things to promote diversity and to promote equality. And if you disagree, if you stand up in public today and you say, hold on, you're talking about giving special favors to one group by putting special burdens and taking away the liberty and taking away the property of other groups. That's not equality. That's tribalism. If you say that in public today, you're immediately labeled as a racist, right, or a hater of some kind.
Well, and then the pushback becomes if we go back to moral relativism, if somebody says something that's objectively false, that's objectively untrue, but we live in this world where if you disagree with a group, if they say 2 + 2 = 5, and then they push back, at one point you get there, right? At one point, we end up at that point of saying, well, I can't tell that group because relatively that group that culture believes that 2 + 2 = 5, right. and therefore it is racist if I disagree with
That's
them.
their truth, right?
That's their truth.
We also hear these phrases, occasionally some high-profile male political figure will be accused of some kind of sexual misconduct by a female, and what a lot of people are quick to say, right, is her truth. Believe her truth. And of course, I'm always asking the question, well, what about the truth? I'm not interested in his truth or her truth. I would kind of like to know the truth, if at all possible. But we're so quick to fall into this relativistic, this framework of cultural relativism where there are just perspectives. And in the end, it's devastating. It's a sad, demoralizing disservice that we're doing. There are universities right now as we talk, Dave, high-profile, old, famous universities are talking openly about not requiring students of certain groups, certain ethnic or sexual groups, sexual orientation groups, that they don't have to take the same exams. They don't have to do the same homework. They're not going to be held to the same academic standard because they have these other obstacles in life that they need to tend to, so therefore they don't need to learn the truth. And that would be okay if the world truly was relativistic. If we just lived in these multiverses where in one world 2 + 2 = 4, and in some other world 2 + 2 = 5, that might work. But we don't. We live in a universe. Universe. That word uni at the begin means one verse, right? There's one law of gravity. There's one human nature that we all participate in. And if you don't come to understand about the world, how the world works, you're going to have a hard time getting along in it.
It's hard to argue that math and science are true, right? There are 2 + 2 = 4. If we're going to start saying, well, this cultural group, whatever it is, believes that 2 + 2 = 5, and we can't judge them for it. We can't decrease their grades for it when they go to university. So you have some engineering student walk in and say, well, in my culture, we learned that 2 + 2 = 5, so you can't tell me I'm wrong.
Right.
The reference that comes to mind is the old Adam Sandler movie, The Waterboy, when he answers everything. Well, my mama says, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter what the professor asks why alligators are ornery,
right?
And he says something crazy, and the teacher says they have a something with their medulla oblongata,
right?
And all of a sudden, Sandler's fighting with this professor because his mama told him
right.
what actually is true.
Right.
But think about that on a larger scale. If you're going to give somebody an engineering degree and that person, we've had to accept that their culture taught them that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
Then do you want to drive across the bridge that they're building, that engineer is building?
And here's where it gets and here's where it's very relevant today. We are seeing movements all across the country to get rid of, jettison, abandon, reject anything that came from morally deficient, morally imperfect people. So I like to imagine the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher Euclid. He wrote a very influential book called The Elements of Geometry that are still taught in geometry classes today. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, just suppose Euclid was the most reprehensible, morally degenerate kind of person imaginable. Say he ruthlessly beat his wife and he owned slaves and he mocked gay people. What else could he do? He mocked some journalists. He did terrible things. Would it still make sense to study his elements of geometry? Or should we reject that because he was imperfect and a slave owner and everything else? And then imagine like you're saying, imagine the engineer who says, I reject anything that comes from morally flawed cultures, which is curious within a framework of cultural relativism. why are slave-owning cultures worse? If every culture is equal and the same, but we'll set that contradiction aside.
Let's talk about that next time.
Right. But someone who rejects everything that came from morally imperfect people or morally imperfect cultures goes and builds a bridge and proudly says, I reject geometry. I reject trigonometry. I reject, Western logocentric mathematics. Man, I'm not driving across that bridge.
No, but do we have to get to the point where you have to start marking every bridge, every table, every chair, right? You started with a cup.
Right.
You started this whole conversation with a cup. At what point do we have to start marking every single cup with who built it, what culture they came from?
Right.
And do people get to say, I'm only buying cups if it came from that culture? And isn't that a sense of racism in and of itself?
I have another book up here. I think, and can the audience see that this is one of the collected works of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche maybe understood this in the most profound way. He thought through to the ultimate conclusion of what the rejection of objective truth and the rejection of reason means. And he put it this way. He said, the modern world, influenced by thinkers like Rousseau, the modern world really is nothing but perspectivism. Everything eventually is going to get dismissed as a perspective. It will start with moral codes and political teachings, but eventually it'll work its way to science. Eventually we will have people saying math, chemistry, right, physics. These two are just perspectives. They're just prejudices. They're just cultural points of view, no more valid, no less valid. Maybe this is a place here to start tying this up. This is perhaps the grand contradiction of all in our politics today. We have a population of people, fellow citizens, many millions of them, who are certain, they are confident that there is no moral truth, that there is no objective moral truth, that human reason cannot discover moral truth. There are just moral perspectives, moral prejudices. You grab onto whatever moral teaching you like, but it's really your will, it's your choice. There is no one objective moral truth. And then they turn around and they are morally repulsed by things they find to be immoral, right? After telling us that there is no moral truth. I mean, go out in public today without a face mask and see how quickly a relativist will denounce you as being shameful, right? That what you're doing is wrong. And they will use that moral language, right? It's wrong what you're doing, after ensuring us that we need all kinds of affirmative action and identity politics and policies that divide citizens into groups, because all cultures are equal. All cultures are somehow equally valid. There's a big contradiction in our world.
Absolutely. Well, let's pick that up next time. Let's start next time. Let's talk about the actual implications of all of this and how identity politics plays into elections, how it plays into current society in a more deep way. And we can get into comments by people like Joe Biden saying, if you vote for Trump, you ain't black.
Until then, we will remain the guardians, no sumos custodes.
Look forward to it.